For more of this kind of content, you can subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. At the center of it all, reclining on an ornate throne, sat Queen Margaret. Her full lips were curled in amusement, her black eyes locked on his with a predatory glint. Donald squared his shoulders, but when he opened his mouth to begin, the Queen raised a single finger. "Take it off," she commanded. For a moment, Donald thought he had misheard. The word hung in the air like a loaded gun, sending a murmur through the palace. The foreign nobles, their violet skin illuminated by crystal light, watched him expectantly. "Excuse me?" Donald's deep voice was calm, but deep down his heart was beating like a war drum. Margaret leaned forward slightly, resting her chin on her hand, and grinned. "On my planet, nudity is a sign of trust. We do not discuss important matters with those who hide behind cloth." Her black eyes flashed with something unreadable. "If we are to negotiate as equals, you must abide by our customs." Donald felt his muscles tense. He was no stranger to cultural differences, but this was beyond anything he had anticipated. When he looked around, everything he saw was either covered in silk or naked, and they stood there, shamelessly proud. Here, clothing was not a necessity, it was a hindrance. The truth hit him with disturbing clarity. If he refused, the negotiations would be over before they even began. Margaret studied his hesitation, then chuckled. "What is it, Earthman? Is your kind so fragile that a little skin makes you weak?" Donald exhaled slowly, forcing his expression to remain neutral, but he wasn't going to make it easy for him either. With deliberate slowness, he unbuttoned the top button of his diplomatic uniform. The court fell silent, his hands moving to the next button. Margaret watched with great interest, her grin widening. "This is going to be an interesting negotiation," she murmured. And Donald had the feeling that he wasn't just talking politics. Donald was not a man easily shaken, but as he unbuttoned the last button of his uniform under Queen Margaret's relentless gaze, he felt something he had not felt in years: uncertainty. Margaret bowed her head, the corners of her mouth lifting in a look both amused and calculating. "Not bad, human," she murmured, "but it's not over yet." Donald clenched his jaw. "You said it was about trust," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I did. Now, let's discuss the alliance." Margaret laughed, a rich, velvety voice that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. "Ah, but trust is not built in a single moment," she replied, rising from her throne with fluid grace. "It is tested. It is stripped away piece by piece." She stepped down from the dais and walked toward him with the deliberate speed of a hunter approaching his prey. The room seemed to close around them, the assembled nobles disappearing into the surroundings as Margaret's presence caught his attention. "You humans," he thought, turning around. "You guard yourselves so fiercely, as if hiding behind layers of fabric makes you stronger." He ran a single finger along her shoulder, his touch feather-light yet searing. "But real power lies in surrendering control." Donald met her gaze, refusing to back away. "I am not surrendering," he said calmly. Margaret's smile deepened. "Then, let's make it interesting." He gestured, and a servant stepped forward, carrying a tray containing 2 thin glasses filled with a shimmering, golden liquid. The smell alone was intoxicating. Something sweet, something dangerous. "A game," Margaret suggested, taking one of the glasses and offering him the other. "A test of wit and will." Donald took the glass but did not drink. "What are the rules?" He took a slow sip of his own drink before answering. "For every question you refuse to answer, you take off a piece of your clothing." His black eyes flashed. "But if you manage to outsmart me, if you turn the question back on me and make me hesitate, then I will be the one giving in." A pulse of defiance rose through Donald's veins. This was no ordinary bargaining. This was a battle of dominance, wits, and power. And Margaret was clearly the master of the game, but he did not know her. If the Queen thought she could play him, she was about to learn a hard lesson. Donald brought the glass to his lips and took a sip. The moment the liquid hit his tongue, warmth spread through his body, seeping into his muscles and making his pulse race. It wasn't just alcohol. There was something else in it, something that made his skin tingle, his senses sharpen. Margaret's smile widened as she watched him. "Shall we begin, human?" Donald exhaled slowly, shrugging. His uniform shirt clung to him. The room was warmer than before, but he didn't let her see him stumble. He met her gaze, smirking slightly. "Let's play." Donald leaned back slightly, rolling the golden liquid over his tongue before swallowing. It burned, but in a way that stimulated his senses. He met Margaret's dark-eyed gaze, noticing the deepening of her grin. So, he said, leaning the glass against his palm. Do I ask the first question, or does your Royal Majesty prefer to set the pace? Margaret giggled. Are you eager to take control already? I admire your ambition, but you are in my court, human. I make the rules. She tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the rim of her glass. And I say, let's start with you. Donald exhaled, measuring her. Okay, ask the question. Margaret's eyes lit up. What was the name of your first lover? Her fingers curled slightly around the glass. She hadn't expected it to snatch at her throat so quickly. She knew what she was doing, stripping away his personal barriers, forcing him to open up in ways beyond the physical. His answer might have been simple, a name, a word, but he was not naive enough to believe she would let him do it. He took a slow breath. A diplomat never reveals personal information to an opponent. Margaret clicked her tongue. Ah, but that means you've given up, and you know the price of refusal. Donald's jaw tightened. At first, it had been a trick, but now it was real. He reached out slowly and untied his tie, the fabric slipping from his fingers. The court watched, some whispering, others observing in silence, as he threw it. Margaret's grin widened. Good, now you understand. Donald exhaled sharply. My turn. He leaned forward, his eyes locked with hers. Who was the last man to really challenge you? Margaret's expression did not change, but a momentary tremor hesitation, calculation crossed her face. He had hit something. He bought himself a moment by swirling his drink idly. Clever, he muttered, bowing his head. I see why they sent you. Donald waited. Finally, he sighed and set his glass aside. Okay. His name was Dorian. His voice dropped slightly, taking on a husky tone. A warrior from a distant system. Powerful, ruthless, completely uncontrollable. He dragged his finger up the side of his neck, as if remembering something. And he made the mistake of thinking he could have me. Donald raised an eyebrow. And what happened to him? Margaret's lips curled dangerously. Let's just say, he underestimated how much I enjoyed winning. A wave of heat coursed through Donald's veins, but he refused to show it. Instead, he bowed his head. Your turn. Margaret's eyes darkened with amusement. What do you want most, human? And don't lie. I can tell. The way he said it made something in his chest tighten. His gaze caught her not just watching, but seeing, searching. He leaned forward slightly, holding her gaze with a steady intensity. Right now, his voice dropped to a lower pitch. I desire to win this game. Margaret took a slow breath, a glimmer of something evil appearing on her face. A noble goal, she murmured. But I suppose that's not all. Donald grinned. You don't have to believe me. You just have to answer my next question. Margaret chuckled, her fingers tapping the edge of her throne. You're good at that, she admitted. Most men crack by now. Most men aren't. I'm beginning to see that. The tension between them had shifted subtle, but undeniable. The game was still political, still strategic, but there was something more, something lurking beneath the surface. A challenge, a challenge. Margaret lifted her glass and took another slow sip. Then it's your turn. Donald didn't hesitate. What do you want from me, Margaret? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he rose from his seat and stepped toward her, his movements fluid and deliberate. When he stopped, he was close enough that she could feel the slight warmth radiating from his skin. I think you already know, he murmured. Donald was determined. Then tell me. Margaret's fingers brushed the collar of his shirt, tracing the fabric, her touch as light as a whisper. I want to see how far I can push you before you break. His pulse was racing. He leaned in slightly, his breath brushing against her ear. And I think you might like it more than you're willing to admit. Donald clenched his jaw. He had spent years trying to keep his emotions in check, to keep himself in check. But damn it, he was making it hard. His voice was steady, but barely. Careful, Queen. If you push too hard, you might be the one who breaks. Margaret laughed softly, her lips close to his. Ah, human, she whispered. I think we're both cracking already. Donald's breathing came slow and measured, but inside, tension was tight in his chest. Queen Margaret stood very close, her violet skin catching the glow of the crystal-lit room. Her scent, something exotic, something dangerous, enveloping him like a trap he wasn't sure he wanted to escape. The game had changed. It wasn't just about power or politics anymore. It was something much more primal, more volatile. Margaret ran a finger along the collar of his shirt, her touch feather-light, but deliberate. You're still dressed, she thought. That'll have to change soon. Donald grinned, masking the pounding of his pulse. You haven't won anything yet. Have you? His black eyes flashed. You seem impressed. He locked eyes with her. And you look impatient. Margaret giggled, pulling back, but never breaking eye contact. Very well, human. Let's see how long you can last. He gestured toward the court, and one of his attendants brought another drink, this one, a darker amber, swirling thickly in the glass. Donald took it, but didn't drink it right away. He raised an eyebrow. What's in it? Margaret's lips twitched in amusement. A little of this, a little of that. Something to make you feel uninhibited. Donald exhaled sharply. So, is giving your guests drugs part of your hospitality? Margaret laughed, her voice rich and warm. No drugs, human. Just a stimulant, something to heighten the sensation. She bowed her head. Are you afraid? Donald brought the glass to his lips, but didn't drink, watching her closely. I'm just curious as to why a queen needs an advantage. His expression faltered just for a moment, but then he smiled. Fair enough. He took another glass from the attendant and took a sip without hesitation. Donald watched his throat work as he swallowed. His own throat was suddenly dry. Damn. He drank. The warmth spread immediately, spreading through his veins. It wasn't unpleasant. It was intoxicating. Every nerve felt alert. Every movement intensified. Even the air against his skin seemed sharper. Margaret moved closer again, watching him. Now, she murmured. Another question. Donald put the glass aside. Go on. Margaret's voice trailed off. What do you think when you look at me? A warmth curled in her stomach. She wasn't playing fair anymore. She could answer diplomatically. She could deflect. Donald took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them again. His voice was steady, but now filled with something deeper. I think you like power, he said. I think you like watching people bend to your will. Margaret raised her delicate eyebrows. And? Donald's eyes roamed over her, taking in every detail, the perfect curve of her lips, the way her violet skin glowed in the room's light, the way she seemed to have as much self-control as he did. And, he continued, his voice trailing off, I think you like the fact that I won't give in so easily. A slow smile spread across his face. Oh, I do, he murmured. The air between them crackled. The room was still full of onlookers, but it didn't matter anymore. It wasn't about diplomacy anymore. Margaret reached out and ran her finger down the center of his chest, where the first button on his shirt was still buttoned. You lasted longer than most, she admitted. But tell me, man, how much longer can you last? Donald breathed through his nose, every nerve burning. He wanted to grin, to make another clever comment, but his restraint was wearing thin. When he finally spoke, his voice was husky. You seem so sure of yourself. Margaret's black eyes flashed. I always have. With deliberate slowness, he reached for his shirt and unbuttoned the first button. A deafening sound could be heard in the silence. Donald's breath caught, but he didn't stop him. His body tensed, every muscle coiling like a live wire. Margaret leaned forward, her lips almost touching his ear. Are you still in control? She whispered. Donald swallowed. He was so close to cracking, but he wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. Her fingers caught his as he moved to the next button, stopping him. The court watched in fascinated silence, as if the universe itself had held its breath. Donald turned his head slightly, their faces now only inches apart. His voice was a low rumble. You'll have to try harder than that, Your Majesty. Margaret's eyes darkened with something obvious. I intend to. The air between them was a lively current, buzzing with something neither could ignore. Donald could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could feel Margaret's breath rising and falling slowly as she was inches away from him. Every look, every movement between them had become a game of restraint. Both of them were dangerously close to losing. Margaret's fingers were still on his shirt at the second button. She was watching him, waiting, daring him to respond. Margaret didn't. Instead, she let her touch linger, letting the warmth of her skin seep through the thin barrier of clothing. Enjoying yourself, Queen? She murmured. Margaret grinned, her full lips curling up like a hunter who knows he's caught his prey right where he wants it. Very much. Her voice was a slow babble, filled with amusement and something deeper. Donald exhaled through his nose, willing his pulse to steady. It was dizzying, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with his title. He had faced death, war, and political betrayal, but here he was feeling more vulnerable than ever, and he knew it. Margaret bowed her head, her silvery hair falling silkily across her shoulders. You're resisting, he observed, his voice filled with quiet amusement. Why? Donald locked eyes with her, his dark eyes locked with hers. Because if I stop resisting, I don't know what will happen next. Margaret's smile deepened. That's what makes it exciting. Her fingers ghosted over the second button on his shirt, irritating him, but not quite undoing it. It was straining him, testing the limits of his self-control. And damn it, He was so close to snapping so close. He grinned, trying to regain some control. You think that's exciting? Provoking a man until he can't breathe? Margaret giggled, her voice low and lustful. Oh, Donald, she muttered, her fingers finally releasing the button. You ain't seen nothing yet. Her breath caught as the fabric parted slightly, exposing more of her chest to the cool air of the throne room. She could feel his gaze roaming over her, examining every inch of her exposed skin. Margaret exhaled, her black eyes shining. Strong, she muttered, almost to herself. Controlled. Donald raised his eyebrows. Are you surprised? Margaret's lips twitched. Not at all. The tips of his fingers brushed her skin just lightly, just enough to tense her muscles. Donald clenched his jaw. He was playing with fire, and he was ready to burn himself. He reached out and grabbed her wrist, stopping her touch before she could go any further. The court was still watching silent, waiting, but it didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the two of them. Margaret drew a sharp breath at his sudden grip, but she didn't pull away. Instead, her grin softened and turned into something else, something more dangerous. You're trembling, he whispered. Donald exhaled slowly. No, he said, his voice harsh. I decide. Margaret raised her delicate eyebrows. What do I decide? Donald leaned in just enough for his breath to hit her skin. Should I let you win? Margaret's lips parted slightly. And, Donald grinned, I don't think I want to. The Queen laughed softly, and this time the voice was actually pleased. Good, he muttered. Then let's see how long you can last. He reached for the next button, and Donald didn't stop him. The tension between them was unbearable, a taut string that threatened to snap at any moment. Margaret's fingers touched the third button on Donald's shirt, the touch feather light yet burning. She wasn't sure if it was the Zealerin drink still throbbing in her veins or the woman in front of her, but wherever she remained, the woman burned, and she knew it. Margaret's black eyes shone with pleasure as she fiddled with the button, her nails digging into his bare skin. Are you still holding out, Donald? She murmured. She exhaled through her nose, her grip tightening at her sides. You're enjoying this too much. She giggled, her voice low and lush. And you're not? Damn it. Every passing second tested every inch of his self-control, tickling the edges of his inhibitions. He had to be stronger. But Margaret wasn't just temptation. She was more. She was a queen who had never been rejected. And he looked at her as if he wanted to devour her. Donald's voice came out harsher than he had intended. What do you get out of this? Margaret bowed her head, considering him. Her silver-white hair brushed over her shoulder, her violet skin glowing in the dim light of the room. What do I get out of this? She echoed, a slow, knowing smile on her lips. Ah, human. You still don't get it, do you? Donald's jaw tightened. Enlighten me then. Margaret leaned forward, her lips inches from his. Power isn't about ruling from a throne, she whispered. It's about knowing exactly when to give. Her fingers pressed against his chest, unbuttoning his shirt a little more, revealing more of his broad frame, and when to force someone to give. Donald swallowed hard. And you think I'll just give? Margaret's grin was intoxicating. You already are. The way he said it so sure made something tighten in his stomach. He was pushing her, and worse, he was right. His inhibitions were hanging by a thread, fraying at the edges. He let out a sharp breath, ran a hand through his dark hair. You like to play games, Margaret smiled. I like to win. Donald's grin returned, dark and dangerous. Then maybe I should change the rules. Margaret raised her eyebrows. Oh? And how do you propose to do that? Her fingers tightened on the fabric of his half-open shirt. If he wanted to play, fine, he could. She would step back, see how much control he really had. Without breaking eye contact, she reached up and undid the remaining buttons herself, letting the shirt slide off her shoulders in one fluid motion. A hush fell over the room. The nobles had been watching silently, observing like ghosts in the background, but now they were murmuring silent approval. But Margaret said nothing. She just stared. Donald stepped forward, closing the gap between them again. Isn't that what you wanted? His voice was lower now, thick with something between defiance and surrender. Let me go? Margaret's grin trembled slightly. It was barely noticeable, but she saw it. Good. She had been in control all this time, directing the game, setting the tempo. But now, on her own terms, she had removed the last obstacle. She had turned the tables, shifted the power between them. Margaret's dark eyes roamed over him, her expression unreadable. But the way her breath hitched just a little told him everything. Careful, human, he muttered. You're beginning to make me wonder. Donald bowed his head, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. And is that dangerous? Margaret reached out, tracing a slow line across his chest with one finger. Very much. Donald took a sharp breath. He could feel the warmth radiating from him, the electrical pull between them tightening like an invisible cord. He wasn't sure who would snap first, but one of them would, and when that happened, there would be no turning back. The room had almost disappeared. The assembled nobles, the towering crystal walls, the ceremonial atmosphere, none of it mattered anymore. All that existed was the space between them, crackling with a warmth neither of them acknowledged, but neither could deny. Margaret's finger traced Donald's chest slowly, deliberately. The touch was light, too light. It left a trail of fire behind it, a ghost of arousing pressure that made his muscles tense involuntarily. "You're holding back," she whispered. Donald clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain still. "And you're enjoying it." Margaret's lips curved. "Of course." He leaned in slightly, his breath hot against her skin. "But I wonder how long you'll resist this." Donald's dark eyes flickered with something unreadable. He had resisted warlords, dictators, and seasoned manipulators. He had survived high-stakes negotiations where one false step could mean the downfall of entire civilizations. And yet, here he was, shirtless before a purple-skinned alien queen, battling something far more dangerous than politics: temptation. Margaret's gaze swept over his exposed torso, lingering there for a heartbeat. She could see it now, the way his fingers hesitated slightly before withdrawing, his own breathing not as steady as he would have liked. He was playing with her, but he was playing back. Donald exhaled, tilting his head slightly as he studied her. "You're doing it again." Margaret raised her eyebrows. "What are you doing?" "I'm stalling." Her voice was soft and steady. "You act like you're in control, but I don't think you expected me to take my shirt off." Margaret's grin faltered, but she didn't deny it. Donald took a slow step forward, invading her space as she had invaded his. The court watched in silence, but neither of them cared anymore. Margaret stood still, but he saw how her breath caught slightly. "Tell me something, Margaret," she murmured. Her black eyes flashed. "Ask, human. What happens when you lose?" Margaret's expression faltered for a moment. "I don't lose." Donald grinned. "Neither do I." For the first time, he could not respond immediately. The air between them was thick, filled with something neither of them dared to name. Margaret reached out for him again, but this time, before he could touch her, Donald grabbed her wrist. She took a sharp breath. His grip was firm, but not strong. His thumb brushed the inside of her wrist, just enough to make her shiver. Donald bowed his head, his voice low. "Your turn to answer a question." Margaret's grin returned, but this time it was weaker, mixed with something else. "Go on." Donald's voice was muffled. "Why are you really doing this?" Margaret's lips parted slightly, but she didn't answer immediately. Donald tightened his grip on her wrist, just enough to remind her that she was no longer in control. The silence stretched. Finally, Margaret exhaled. "Because," she whispered, "I want to see what happens when it finally breaks." Donald's breath caught. Damn it, damn himself. Because at that moment, he wasn't sure who would break first. The silence between them was thick, tense as a knife balanced on its edge. Margaret's confession, her challenge, hung in the air, daring her to respond, to unravel. Donald exhaled through his nose, still holding her wrist tightly. Margaret didn't pull away. She didn't need to. He had her exactly where he wanted her, and she knew it. But what he didn't know, what he didn't count on, was that he wanted to see how far she was willing to go. Slowly, deliberately, he let go of her wrist. The warmth of her skin lingered in his palm as he pulled back just enough to break the suffocating tension. Margaret studied him, her dark eyes flashing. "Are you already pulling away?" she murmured. Donald grinned, shaking his head. "No," he said, his voice low and even. "I'm just making sure you can't control everything." Margaret chuckled, bowing her head. "Ah, human," she mumbled, her silvery hair falling over her shoulders. "I've been in control since the moment you set foot in my palace." Donald rounded his shoulders, staying calm. "If you say so." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, but there was fun behind them. She loved it, the pushing and pulling, the testing of wills. And damn it, so did he. He stepped forward, reclaiming the space between them with a slow, deliberate grace. His fingertips brushed across her bare arm, tracing the defined muscle there, and then rested lightly on her chest. "Tell me something, Donald," she muttered. Her breathing came slow and measured, but every nerve she touched burned. "What?" Her nails scraped against his skin, barely a whisper of emotion. What do you think will happen when it breaks? Donald took a sharp breath, his jaw clenched. You seem so sure I'm going to do it. Margaret's lips curled. Because everyone else does. Donald exhaled slowly. Maybe I'm not like everyone else. Margaret's fingers remained still on his chest. Margaret looked at him, and for a moment, something unreadable crossed her face. A flash of uncertainty, curiosity. Then it was gone, replaced by her usual confidence. Let's find out, he whispered. And then he unbuttoned the next button. The fabric of his shirt unraveled even more, slipping completely off his shoulders. Donald could barely hear the murmurs of the gathered Zilarians. All he could focus on was the warmth spreading between them, the maddeningly slow way Margaret's fingers brushed his skin. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe. Margaret exhaled, her gaze dark and triumphant. You're shaking, she noted, echoing his earlier words. Donald met her eyes. No, he mumbled. I'm waiting. Margaret's grin faltered slightly. For what? Donald's voice was harsh, controlled, dangerous. For you to break first. For the first time, Queen Margaret's breath caught. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The tension had reached its peak, balanced on the edge of a knife. One of them would give up. And when they did, the game would be over. The throne room had never felt so small. The air between them was thick, oppressive, charged with something neither of them dared name. Margaret's breathing came slow and measured, but Donald could see it, the slight tension in her shoulders, the gentle curl of her fingers against his skin, as if she were grounding him. He had used the game against him, and he wasn't sure how to respond. Donald bowed his head, his voice low and determined. You hesitate. Margaret's dark eyes flickered, a momentary thing. Uncertainty? Number? Not exactly. Something more dangerous. Amusement. And then he smiled again, slow and deliberate. Ah, human, he murmured. Do you think you've won? Donald exhaled through his nose. I know I have. Margaret laughed softly, her lips curling in a way that made his pulse race in his throat. Insolent, he thought, running his fingers over his chest with deliberate slowness. And yet, I still stand here. His touch was like fire, not from the drink, not from some foreign stimulant coursing through his veins, but because he was himself. And that was the real problem. Margaret leaned forward, her breath hot in his ear. Tell me, Donald, she whispered. Why are you still here? Donald clenched his jaw. He could have walked away. He could have walked out of this room and demanded that the negotiations be conducted on Earth's terms. But he didn't, because deep down he didn't want that. His voice was harsh. I don't know anymore. Margaret chuckled, and the sound sent another involuntary shiver through her. Good, she muttered. Now we're getting somewhere. She pulled back just long enough to look into his eyes. For the first time, there was no mockery in his gaze. No mockery. Just something raw. Something dangerous. Donald swallowed hard. He wasn't sure he had the strength to walk away anymore. Margaret reached for his belt, and then he grabbed her wrist again, stopping her. The whole room seemed to freeze. Margaret took a deep breath, her eyes darting up to meet his. Donald's grip was tight, but his hand wasn't shaking. He wasn't resisting out of fear. He was resisting because he wasn't sure what would happen next if he continued, and neither was she. They stared at each other for a long moment, locked in a battle for control that neither of them could afford to lose. Then Margaret exhaled, a slow, careful breath, and she smiled. You're not ready to break, she murmured, her voice almost approving. Donald swallowed. Neither are you. Margaret's grin deepened, and then, to his surprise, he pulled back. The absence of his touch was almost worse than its presence. Margaret turned and walked toward her throne with the same confidence she had when she started this game. She sank into the chair, crossed one leg over the other, and looked at him with a knowing expression. This isn't over, human, she said softly. But for now, you've won my attention. Donald exhaled, regaining his composure. He wasn't sure if he had won or not, but one thing was certain. The real game had only just begun. Donald stood there shirtless, breathing slow and heavy, as Queen Margaret leaned back in her throne, her black eyes locked with amusement, and something darker, something neither of them wanted to say out loud. This had gone too far, and yet neither of them could stop. Margaret grinned, one hand resting lazily on the armrest of her throne, the other tracing the stem of her glass. You look restless, human. Donald clenched his fists at his sides, trying to steady himself. And you look very pleased. He chuckled, taking a slow sip of his drink, never breaking eye contact. Shouldn't I be? You've been playing my game longer than any man before you. He exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to focus, And what happens when the game no longer matters? Margaret's lips twitched, her eyes flashing with something dangerous. You're saying it's not? Donald ran a hand through his dark hair, the muscles in his arms tensing as he fought to maintain control. He needed to get this back on track. He was here for diplomacy, for an alliance, not for whatever the hell he was getting himself into. But then Margaret moved, not lazily, not playfully. No, this time she rose from her throne like a queen with a resolve. She walked toward him with purpose, each step echoing in the silent room, her violet skin glowing in the ambient light. The murmurs of the court were gone. There was nothing but the sound of their breathing, the tension humming between them like a live wire. And then, suddenly, she was in front of him again, standing close enough for him to feel the warmth radiating from her body. Margaret lifted her hand and placed it on his bare chest. Donald inhaled sharply. This time, his touch was not soft. It was firm, grounding, almost assertive. You talk about control, human, he murmured, his voice like silk against her ears. But do you know what you're trying to control now? Donald's pulse roared in his ears. I'm trying to keep this from getting out of control. Margaret ducked her head, her silvery white hair falling over her shoulder. Then you've already lost. And before she could react, he pushed her away. Not hard, just enough to throw her off balance, enough to make her step back. And damn it, that tiny moment of movement, that split second of losing ground, sent something like lightning through her veins. Margaret grinned. See? She's slipping, isn't she? Donald gritted his teeth. I'm still standing. Margaret's eyes fluttered, and then before she could, he grabbed the belt around her waist. Margaret grabbed her wrist again, gripping it tightly. Margaret. His voice was a warning, a plea, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned in, his lips inches from her ear, his breath hot and slow. Give me a break, Donald, she whispered. Her inhibitions shattered. Donald moved before he thought, his hands grasping her waist and pulling her toward him. Margaret gasped softly, not in surprise, not in protest, but in something else entirely. Approval. The court stirred around them, but neither of them cared. It wasn't politics anymore. It wasn't power. It was something much more dangerous, and neither of them would stop now. The moment Donald pulled her toward him, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The court, the nobles, the ever-watchful servants, none of them mattered anymore. The game they had been playing had been shattered, replaced by something raw and electric. Margaret didn't resist. She didn't push him away. Instead, she grinned, her black eyes ablaze with triumph. Finally, she murmured, her voice like velvet, a slow, burning fire coursing through her veins. Donald exhaled sharply, his grip still on her waist. He could feel the warmth of her violet skin through the thin silk she wore, the barely visible barrier between them doing nothing to ease the crackling intensity in the space they now shared. He should have pulled back. He should have moved away. But he didn't, because damn it, he was right. He had already lost control. Margaret bowed her head slightly, her silvery hair spilling over her shoulders as she studied him. You're trying so hard to hold yourself back, he muttered, running a single finger down his chest, over the hard planes of muscle. Why? Donald swallowed, his voice low and harsh. Because this wasn't meant to be. Margaret chuckled, the sound sending another shiver down his spine. Oh, human, she muttered. Everything that happens in my court is exactly what I want. Her fingers slid lower, dancing along the line of his belt. Donald's breath caught. His hand shot out, grabbing his wrist again, but this time, not just to stop him, to steady himself. Margaret leaned forward, her lips dangerously close to his ear. You're shaking again, she whispered. Donald clenched his jaw. No, he muttered. I'm bracing myself. Margaret laughed softly, her hot breath caressing his skin. For what? Donald's fingers tightened around her wrist, his other hand still resting on the curve of her waist. He looked at her, his black eyes burning with something unspoken. For the moment, I decided to stop holding back. The challenge was there, hanging between them, unspoken, but deafening. Margaret's grin paused for only a fraction of a second, and then he whispered, Then stop. Donald took a sharp breath, and he did. His restraint snapped like a cord pulled too tightly for too long. Before he could second-guess himself, before reason could step in and push him away, he moved. Margaret gasped as they shifted positions, his grip firm but careful as he pressed her against the obsidian throne. For the first time, he looked genuinely surprised, but he didn't resist. Instead, he laughed low, lustful, triumphantly. Oh, I really do love it when a man finally learns his place. he murmured, his eyes dark with approval. Donald grinned, his hands resting on either side of the throne. Be careful, Queen, he murmured, his voice thick with warning. You may find that I am not as broken as you expected. Margaret licked her lips, her gaze roaming over him, taking in every inch of his exposed skin. Oh, I hope so. The tension between them was unbearable. Every breath was a battle, every look a silent war. There was no turning back now. Margaret reached out slowly, deliberately, and ran a single finger along the sharp line of his jaw. Now, she whispered, her voice full of promise. Let's see what you are truly made of. The throne room was silent. The tension between them had reached its peak, stretched so thin that a single breath could shatter it. Donald and Margaret stood locked in a battle of wills, of desire, of something neither of them had the words for. But something had shifted. The game was over, and what came next, neither of them had truly prepared for. Margaret's black eyes gleamed as she traced her finger down his jawline. I wonder, she murmured, tilting her head slightly. Do you regret it? Donald's breathing was slow, measured, but his pulse roared beneath his skin. Regret what? Margaret's lips curled, teasing, but there was something else, something beneath the surface. Letting yourself lose. Donald exhaled sharply. I didn't lose. Margaret arched a brow. Then what do you call this? Donald smirked, leaning in just enough that his breath ghosted against her skin. A draw. Margaret let out a quiet laugh, but there was something different in her eyes now, less amusement, more curiosity. She studied him, really studied him, as if seeing him for the first time. And maybe she was. Because this wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about power or control or breaking one another down. It was about what came next. Margaret reached out, pressing her palm against his chest, right over his heart. She felt the steady, unyielding beat beneath her fingertips. It wasn't racing, not with fear, not with hesitation. It was steady, grounded. And for the first time in her life, Margaret wasn't sure who had won. She inhaled slowly. You should leave, human. Donald's jaw tightened. Is that an order? Margaret's smirk softened, but it wasn't playful. No. Her fingers curled slightly against his skin. It's a warning. Donald didn't move. Because? Margaret hesitated, just for a moment. Then she exhaled. Because if you stay, she said quietly, neither of us will ever be the same. The weight of her words settled over them like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just a game anymore. It wasn't just a fleeting attraction, a battle of dominance and restraint. This was something bigger, something dangerous. Donald studied her, his dark eyes unreadable. He could see it now buried beneath the confident smirk, beneath the teasing and the power plays. Margaret was just as caught in this as he was. And that was terrifying, because Margaret wasn't just an alien queen. She was a force of nature, and if he let himself fall into her orbit, he wasn't sure if he'd ever escape. But maybe he didn't want to. Donald exhaled through his nose. Then tell me, Margaret. His voice was quiet, steady. Do you want me to leave? Silence. Margaret's expression didn't change. She didn't flinch, didn't waver, but she also didn't answer, and that was all Donald needed to know. He reached up, his fingers brushing against hers where they still rested on his chest. Slowly, deliberately, he closed his hand over hers. Margaret inhaled softly. Donald smirked, but it was softer now, quieter. Then I'm staying. Margaret's lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but no words came. Because there was nothing left to say. There was no more battle to fight, no more walls left between them. This was inevitable. Margaret's fingers curled against his chest, gripping him just slightly, as if anchoring herself. Donald's hand tightened over hers, and together they stepped into the unknown. Donald stood on the high balcony overlooking the Capitol, the wind cool against his bare skin. He had come here as a diplomat, an outsider. Now he wasn't sure what he was. A shift in the air behind him made him turn. Margaret stood there, watching him. She wore none of her usual royal attire, just a simple silk robe draped over her shoulders, her silver-white hair slightly tousled from sleep. She studied him for a long moment, as if still trying to understand what had happened, what they had become. Donald smirked. Regretting it already, Your Majesty? Margaret chuckled, shaking her head. No, human. She stepped forward, stopping just in front of him. Just adjusting. Donald exhaled a quiet laugh, looking back out at the horizon. Yeah, me too. Margaret was silent for a moment. Then she reached out, threading her fingers through his. Donald glanced down at their joined hands. He raised a brow. "What happened to your rules about nudity?" Margaret smirked, squeezing his hand slightly. "I told you, human." Her black eyes gleamed in the morning light. "On my planet, nudity shows love." Donald exhaled, shaking his head with a quiet laugh. "Guess I'll have to get used to that." Margaret's lips curled. "Oh, you will." And as the sun continued to rise over Zalera, Donald knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same again, and he wouldn't have it any other way.